Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Many watchers of the Missouri General Assembly were not optimistic that the 2024 session would be that successful. They point to the fact that it's an election year, and they also point to stark divisions within the Missouri Senate's Republican caucus. Some of those fissures were in full display in the early weeks of session, as members of the newly formed Missouri Freedom Caucus got into explosive back and forths with GOP Senate leaders. And while the specific blow-ups seem to vary from day to day, Missouri Freedom Caucus members like Senator Bill Eigel of Weldon Spring contend that members of Republican leadership are not prioritizing GOP principles.
And yet we have seen time after time these things fall through when it became politically expedient to torpedo the things that I believe are most important to this state.
At the center of this inter-party wrangling is Senator Cindy O'Laughlin. O'Laughlin is the Senate Majority Leader responsible for the bills that come to the floor and for navigating the complex personalities of a chamber renowned for its rancor. And while tensions have generally cooled over the past couple of weeks, it's not a sure thing that the relative peace will last. The Shelbina Republican represents the state's 18th senatorial district, which includes a slew of counties in northeast Missouri. Senator O'Laughlin, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you, Jason, for having me on.
As the Senate Majority Leader, you get probably one of the closest views to factionalism within the chamber's GOP caucus. Why do you think this continues to be a storyline year after year after year?
I think that anytime you have something that's negative, it gets the press corps' attention. You don't really hear them report when everyone's getting along and you get something done because negative news sells. So I think that's part of it. And just the personalities involved make it sort of a long-lasting situation that we have in the Senate.
The legislature needs to reauthorize a critical tax on hospitals that funds the state's Medicaid program. It's known as the Federal Reimbursement Allowance. And some members of the Missouri Freedom Caucus have threatened to hold that bill up unless there's language barring money, state money from going to Planned Parenthood. Do you think that this is a bill where these aforementioned factions could actually matter in terms of policymaking?
Well, if you were to talk to each senator behind the scenes, regardless of which faction they are a part of, they all admit readily that this is something that has to be renewed. And I know, I'm not sure everyone knows if they're not, observing the Senate year after year. But whenever this comes up for renewal, it's always leveraged. And I think it's an attempt by this year, by people who are running for another office. They do want support from various groups who tend to take a very hard line. And so they're willing to leverage this. And it's a huge amount of money. And while I understand that some people feel the different rules involved in it and the amount of expense involved in it maybe merits us looking at it more closely and coming up with a different solution, I wouldn't argue that. Maybe it does merit a closer look and a different solution. But you don't take something that in the end totals about $4.5 billion that pays for really the most vulnerable people in hospitals and nursing homes and say, I'm not going to renew that this year. They know it's an empty threat, and we know it's an empty threat. If they wanted to do something different or or well, I say they, if anyone wants to change policy that's in place for this many Missourians, then I say, file something at the beginning of the year and have a plan for how that would be implemented. And serious senators do that. They see something they think could be done better or differently, and they file a bill so that you then engage the public, you engage all the people that it matters to, or you try to, and you try to come up with a solution, a bipartisan solution. And that has not been done. So it's political theater. I don't like it. And, I've made that clear. And ultimately, it will get renewed. So, it's an exercise in getting press coverage.
Well, we've received a number of listener questions, and not about the tumult in the Senate, but about issues that may or may not cross the Senate chamber, like the FRA. Brian K. on Twitter asks, why do you support initiative petition reform? Who does it benefit? And what we mean by initiative petition reform are proposals that would make it more difficult to amend the state's constitution. So why? I know you're a big supporter of this, and I'd like to know why.
Well, I sort of liken it to the Electoral College. The legislature is largely Republican. All Republicans are not the same, as we see, and everyone doesn't think alike. But issues come before the legislature that, after some thought and work, and sometimes years of it, we refuse to do something because we feel it's not in the best interest of the citizens, or we don't have the money, or whatever the case might be. And that's when the initiative petition process comes into play. And generally, it's a progressive issue right now. If it's some time in the future changed and the legislature was largely Democrat, maybe you would have someone that's ultra-conservative say, well, listen, I can't get this through.
Well, that's what's, not to interrupt, but that's what was happening when Governor Nixon was in office. A lot of Republicans in the legislature put things on the ballot to go around his veto. So it's actually more recent than that. But continue.
Well, so at least from my perspective, I feel that we do thoughtfully consider different ideas and different things that people want to do. We have to come to a decision about whether we think that is the right course or not. And so the things that in the recent past that have gone through the initiative petition process have been Medicaid expansion is one. We felt that could become very fiscally burdensome to the state, to the point that other critical things would have to not be funded. So we did not want to do that, and that was done through initiative petition. We did not want to do medical marijuana, so that came through the initiative petition, and then recreational marijuana. And so, those are three sort of, I would call it progressive solutions or ideas. And most of the money that pays for this does come from out of state in the millions of dollars. And basically, the urban areas outvote the rural areas. So I'm in favor of the reform that we have suggested, which would require that you not only get 50% plus one, you also have to get, in the case of what we have passed, 5 of 8 congressional districts, so that you are representing more of Missouri.
The ballot item that passed out of the Senate did not include other provisions, including language barring non-citizens from voting. And this has widely been seen as, quote, ballot candy aimed at making this measure easier to pass. Do you agree with the decision to take those out? And do you expect, that decision to stand, and that what ends up going before voters will just be an up or down vote on making it harder to amend the Constitution?
I think if it comes back from the House with any provision on it, it will be the one that you just mentioned. And I expect it to pass.
We're talking with Senator Cindy O'Laughlin. She is the Senate Majority Leader and also the senator from Missouri's 18th District. I wanted to keep on the subject of initiative petitions. You mentioned marijuana, both medicinal and recreational passing, as something that I guess the legislature, thought was shoehorned by special interest money. We recently read articles that there's been well over $1 billion of marijuana sales in Missouri, more than Colorado. Isn't that a sign that the people genuinely wanted this, and this is not an example of a special interest group tricking people into doing something they didn't want?
I'm involved in a lot of different issues in the state, and one of the issues that is very concerning to me is the dysfunctional families and the high rate of mental issues that people have. So selling $1 billion worth of marijuana, it indicates, sort of verifies some of my concerns, and that is, we have sort of a in some cases, I would call it societal collapse. We have very dysfunctional families. We have a lot of children who are at risk. And I think it's not, just a figment of my imagination that people now have access to something that, helps them feel better. Well, I'm not against people feeling better, but I do think we have some issues that are going to require some hard work and concentration. And I don't think a high use of marijuana helps us have hard work and concentration.
It probably doesn't help. It probably doesn't help that there's not a lot of research about the side effects or the benefits of marijuana because it's heavily restricted by the federal government. So we don't really know what the effects are, though there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that if you take too much, it could be harmful, but if you take it in moderation, it could be helpful towards a lot of things. But continue.
Way back in the day when I was in college, marijuana was fairly heavily used, and the effect of it was a lethargic individual who wasn't operating at their full capacity. And I have no reason to believe that it's any different now.
Well, moving away from this particular point of the initiative petition process, some supporters of raising the constitutional amendment threshold have made no secret that they want voters to pass this in order to stymie a ballot item legalizing abortion. Do you also want to pass this to make sure that a proposed abortion legalization measure is harder to pass in November?
Yes. I think that the protection of life is obviously important to our legislature. This is why we have banned abortion. I understand that there are people who feel it has gone too far, and I also understand that, there's vulnerable mothers who are in very hard situations that we need to support them through. So it's a very hard topic. But I do believe an unborn child is a human being. And as far as the initiative petition process goes, if that results in us having more of a voice in the rural areas, which I believe we need, and I believe is more conservative than urban areas, and if that will offset an effort to try to reinstate abortion, absolutely, I think that's a good thing.
Well, why not just run an effective opposition campaign against the constitutional amendment to legalize abortion? Why would you need to change the whole process in order to ensure that it's unlikely to pass? Because
of the fact that the urban areas are much more progressive and will outvote the rural areas. It's the same for me, maybe not for everyone, but for me. That's why we have the Electoral College. If we didn't have it, New York and California would determine how we live because they have, greater numbers. But it's not an adequate representation of everyone. So that's why we have the Electoral College, and I feel the same way about the initiative petition process.
We got another question from Oh Girl on Instagram. Sometimes the names of our listeners are a little creative. So just bear with us with that for that, Senator. Gun laws. Our children are dying. It's horrible. We need reasonable gun laws ASAP to prevent mass shootings. Now, GOP lawmakers have been very opposed to any restrictions on guns for many years. Why?
Well, because gun laws only affect law-abiding citizens. So I think Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation, and they also have the highest murder rate, one of the highest murder rates in the country. I mean, you know, we have laws against murdering people, and obviously those are disregarded. So I feel, and I think a lot of my colleagues feel, that if you add on more restrictions to owning a gun, then you are taking away the law-abiding citizens' ability to defend themselves and their property, because they're the only ones who follow the law. I mean, a criminal is going to find a gun, and they're going to do what they're going to do, regardless of the law.
What about barring juveniles from openly carrying weapons? My understanding is there's been some opposition to this idea because it could ensnare minors who are hunting in rural areas. But isn't there a way to craft the legislation where it doesn't ensnare that particular group of people?
Well, I haven't seen that, if there's a way to do that. I mean, I would say that if there's one thing we're pretty well united on, it's we're not going to curtail the right to protect yourself and your property. If it comes to youth's open carrying and there's some form of way of writing something that's not going to negatively affect everyone, I've not seen it.
Mm-hmm. I think that there just seems to be, like, I don't want to say a disconnect, but a pretty extreme difference of opinions between people that live in urban and suburban areas and rural and exurban areas when it comes to guns. You know,
I agree with that.
Is there any way to, like, bridge the divide between these two points of views? Because it seems like, you know, one side of this feels like they're not being heard by a largely Republican and rural legislature.
Well, I mean, I think you make a good point in that in the rural area, everyone has guns. I mean, almost every family has guns in the house, and kids know how to use them. It's a routine way of life. So I think you make a good point in that urban people, you know, just because of the proximity of people, and you don't have wide open spaces where you can, you know, go out and shoot your gun and have target practice or whatever. So I think people have sometimes an irrational fear of something that they're not familiar with, and maybe that has something to do with that divide. I know that the rural people will always feel the way they feel right now, which is we learn to store guns safely. We learn to use them. Our kids know how to use them. We know how to protect ourselves, and it's our right to do that. So we're pretty firmly in that camp.
By the way, per the Pew Research Center, 47% of adults living in rural areas report to personally owning a firearm. One of the questions we got from Ariel Forland on Instagram is, when is the legislature going to focus more on jobs and housing and less on talking points? And I think that kind of comes to a question about how there just hasn't been a lot of confidence that there's going to be a lot of legislation passed this year because of the election and because of the aforementioned infighting. Do you think that by the time we talk with you in May, you could come to reporters and say, we exceeded those low expectations?
Well, there's days when I feel like if we just have a normal day, we've already exceeded them. I think when people want us to focus on jobs and housing, maybe they're a little bit misguided. I mean, I feel like we should be creating the environment that allows people to create jobs. And as far as the housing sector goes, there's been a lot of mistakes made in that area, in my opinion. The trades were very much sort of vilified and minimized for years. And kids were all told, that they had to go to college to have any kind of a good future. Well, I disputed that. I just want to note that years ago when I was on the school board. And here we are. We have a very lacking workforce that can do any of the skilled trades. So now we're trying to turn that around. But that's the kind of thing that, government decides, I'm going to decide what's best for you. And now I'm going to direct all policy and taxation policy, education policy, all those kinds of things to achieve what we think is best. And that usually is devised by people who have either worked for the government all their life or, worked in a situation where they were not running their own company and understanding how things actually work in the private market. And so it has distorted the market. And we now have kids who maybe have college degrees, but can't really seem to do much of anything. And so I think that's a huge mistake. I think that's, now being reversed. But most of the workforce in the housing sector is getting into their early 60s, and the retirements are coming on wave after wave, and there's not people to take their place.
Cindy O'Loughlin is the Senate Majority Leader who represents the 18th Senatorial District in the Missouri Senate. Senator O'Loughlin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
When we return, we'll talk with St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Kellogg about what to expect during the legislature's second half. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. I'm now joined in studio by Sarah Kellogg, who is St. Louis Public Radio's Statehouse and Politics reporter. Sarah, welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
It's good to be back, Jason.
I always get hung up on the word reporter for some reason.
You just turned from Bostonian for a second?
Yeah, pretty much. What were your impressions of my conversation with O'Loughlin?
I think my initial impression is that the narrative pushed by the Freedom Caucus, that it's them versus leadership and they're ones upholding conservative values. I think listening to Senator O'Loughlin, she's conservative. The differences in policy really aren't different. And I think that really highlights how conservative the Missouri Senate is with its members, but also where the difference is keeping the Senate running and the compromises and the work that goes into that and what obstructs it. So, Senate President Pro Tem Caleb Rowden has repeatedly said that ultimately the goal from Republicans, all of them, is the same most of the time. There are just fractions on how that gets done.
One of my takeaways was that there's not going to be any sort of gun control law that comes to the floor. And she might mention Chicago, which I know she said one of the highest murder rates and some of the toughest gun laws. But California's are generally seen as tougher, according to an NPR report in 2017. But, Chicago is surrounded by states with weaker gun laws, which I know is often brought up as a reason why gun violence in Chicago is so high. But couldn't that also be an argument that state-by-state gun laws may not be as effective as proponents want?
I'm talking about whether or not what I've heard on gun arguments. The truth is I haven't really heard any arguments about gun control lately because that's just not happening in either chamber. This past week, Senator Denny Hoskins presented a bill that would prohibit the state from enforcing any form of red flag law. And then there was the news that the House will not be taking up legislation this session that allows concealed carry permit holders to bring firearms on public transportation or in places of worship, but that was after a very public shooting at the Chiefs Parade in Kansas City. And since then, that's really been it. Post-shooting, Democrats have really been calling for those conversations to happen, but they just haven't, and I don't think it will.
And red flag laws are a judicial process which would allow for a judge to disarm somebody who is a threat to themselves or others.
Yes, and temporarily, I think that's one of the bigger things, too, about that. But that there was some action on the floor about an anti-flag red flag law that didn't get any traction, but so far it's only been heard in committee.
Now, as we talked about, there are two things the legislature needs to do: pass a budget and pass the FRA, Federal Reimbursement Allowance, tax on hospitals. Super important for the Medicaid program. How difficult is it going to be to get those things done?
It's going to be really tough. The early rumors were that the FRA was supposed to be done earlier. It was one of the first thing. I think it was the first thing on the to explain the process. There's like a calendar that the Senate has to follow on, like the formal. It was number one, and it was laid over, and they haven't brought it up since. And the House apparently is waiting for the Senate to pass it, so they're not doing a version. So right now the question is when it will be brought up in the Senate. And as Senator O'Loughlin said, it is being leveraged. I think there's a lot of want for language that would bar Medicaid reimbursements from going to facilities that perform abortions or their affiliates, which basically means Planned Parenthood facilities in the state. And the other thing is that this version of the FRA so far does not have a sunset, which means that if it were passed, it wouldn't be brought up again. I don't think that's very popular from some of the more conservative members.
But staying on the subject of Planned Parenthood,
yes.
Most of what we're talking about here, and it's probably all because there really are no abortions happening in Missouri, is money that is Medicaid payments for things like cancer screenings or birth control, not abortions. But why do you think there's been such a push by Republicans to end funding for those types of things?
I think the push, because there is, the House has passed its version. The Senate had debated theirs for a little while. I think, honestly, part of the push is because it's an election year that is a pretty, constant platform for Republicans is against Planned Parenthood. I think there's also a push. I think the Planned Parenthood language 2Bs, there's a push because of the FRA. There's basically, it's to be believed that in order, and the Conservative Caucus or Freedom Caucus members talked about this, that Planned Parenthood defunding, a separate bill, has to be passed before the FRA being quote unquote clean is even an option. So I think that's a leveraging point for them, is if you want an FRA without those limitations, that bill has to go through. I think there's another push because this is a new attempt. This is statute. Prior versions tried to do it through the budget, and that repeatedly failed. So I think that's also why there's a push for this.
We've talked a lot about the election affecting the session. Newsflash, there's going to be a major election cycle in August and November. How have you seen that play out in real time?
I would say at the beginning of session this year, the Senate really did feel different. I think that it was because there was just immediate delays and a lot of tensions right away, where normally it's a crescendo and we started high and we've kind of leveled a little bit more. I think there are tensions there. I'm not sure how different it is from other moments in the legislature, though. And I think that is a very subjective question of whether or not the election year has been an impact. But you know what? I think lawmakers certainly think we've had, and they've said it repeatedly on the floor. So if they think so too, well, that is ultimately impact.
You got to take them for their word. I mean, and also a lot of those legislators are running for other things too.
Absolutely.
When we put out a call for questions for O'Loughlin, we got a number that are similar to this one from Allison Hughes. What tangible benefit will Missourians be able to see from this legislative session in their everyday lives? Now, this is a subjective question. Some people may be like, they don't pass anything, that's great. If they don't pass anything, that's bad. But if the legislature's main accomplishments this year are the FRA and the budget, will the legislature be reaching the principle that Allison Hughes mentioned in her question?
I think that's a really good question. I think if they get the FRA done without a special session, that is a huge accomplishment, because it didn't happen last time it came around. It did require a special session to get that done. So funding, a bulk of the state's Medicaid program and funding rural hospitals, I think that is a big lift. But I think that, I don't know, I think it's too early to see what any tangible effects this session will have, because nothing's really been passed yet. I think education's a good example of that. There could be a big education package. There couldn't be. So I think it's a wait and see moment.
Well, we will wait and see, and we will be watching Sarah Kellogg, the Statehouse politics reporter for St. Louis Public Radio, over the next few weeks and months. Sarah, thank you for joining us.
You got it. Thanks so much.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wisentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich, and our production intern is Roche Hemmings.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group. Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.